The 1930s were defined as the Great Depression. The Great Depression caused banking panics, economic decline, and the Dust Bowl also began. But also during 1931 to 1935, a gang was running around who would rob banks, strange, and engineer two major kidnappings of rich business executives. Let's meet the leaders of this gang. Meet Frederick George Barker. He was born December 12, 1901, to George Elias and Arizona Donnie Clark Ma Barker in Aurora, Mississippi. The family had moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1912. His childhood was surrounded by crimes due to his older brothers Herman, Lloyd, and Arthur Dock, who belonged to a gang of local delinquent youths called the Central Park Gang. The brothers grew up in a sharecropping family. They would meet in the park to plan crimes and stash their stolen goods. There, Fred would meet future members of the Barker Karpis gang, including Vonnie Davis. The boys fell soon into hardened criminals that would rob banks and kill without provocation. Doc would be sentenced to life imprisonment after murdering a night watchman. Herman would commit suicide on August 29, 1927, after being badly injured in a shootout with police in Wichita, Kansas, following the robbery of a Newton ice plant in Newton, Kansas, with Charles Gallup and Porter Meeks. Lloyd was sentenced to 25 years in 1922 for mail theft and released in 1938. He was a U.S. Army cook at a POW camp and then murdered by his wife in 1949. Ma herself was not a criminal, but she did her part to help her sons. She would badger parole boards, wardens, and governors for the release of her boys when they were incarcerated. He was first arrested and imprisoned in 1927 for burglary. While he was in prison, he met Elvis Karpis. According to Karpis, Barker was a prominent figure in jail who was able to obtain marijuana and other perks. Karpis also said he was a natural-born killer who never hesitated. Unlike Karpis, who was nicknamed Creepy Karpis, Barker was known for his personal charm. He would be released in 1930. Let me introduce you to Arthur Raymond Doc Barker. Doc was born June 4, 1899. He was described by one writer as a dimwit and a drunk who was not much more than a feudal thug. Doc was born in Aurora, Missouri, the son of George Elias Barker and Arizona Ma Barker. On July 18, 1918, Barker was arrested for stealing a car on the highway and was sent to serve prison time in Joplin, Missouri. On February 19, 1920, he escaped from Joplin prison using the pseudonym Claude Dade. Barker was involved in robberies in Oklahoma. He was arrested and imprisoned at Oklahoma State Penitentiary under the name Bob Barker from January to June 1921. On August 25, 1921, Barker and three other men robbed a woman at a hospital construction site in Tulsa. The three men were surprised by a night watchman, Thomas Sherrill. When Sherrill saw them, he opened fire. Sherrill was fairly shot when two of the men shot at him while fleeing the scene. After Sherrill's family hired a private investigator, Barker and another man, Vonnie Curley Davis, who worked at the construction site was friendly with the Barker family, were arrested for Sherrill's murder. On January 14, 1922, Barker was convicted of Sherrill's murder and sentenced to a life term at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Barker appealed the conviction and always maintained his innocence of this crime. He was paroled 10 years later on September 10, 1932. After his release, Barker joined up with his brother Fred and Karpis. By this time, Barker was described as a morose, heavy-drinking man and a stone-eyed killer. According to one woman associated with the Barker Karpis gang, Barker had little interest in female company and was awkward around women, something she attributed to his institutionalized life in prison. On December 16, 1932, Barker participated in the robbery of the Third Northwestern Bank in Minneapolis. 2 policemen were killed in that robbery, and a civilian was murdered by Barker's brother Fred during the getaway. Now, let me introduce you to Alvin Karpis. He was born August 10, 1907, to Lithuanian immigrants John Jonas and Anna Karpavikas in Montreal, Quebec, and was raised in Topeka, Kansas. At the age of 10, he started running around with gamblers, bootleggers, and pimps. In 1926, he was sentenced to the State Industrial Reformatory in Hutchinson, Kansas, for an attempted burglary. He escaped with another inmate, Lawrence Duvall, and went on a year-long crime spree, interrupted briefly when he lived with his parents after Duvall was arrested. After moving to Kansas City, Missouri, he was caught stealing a car and sent back to the reformatory. He was then transferred to the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, where he would meet Fred Barker, who was in prison for bank robbery. Barker was one of the notorious members of the Bloody Bakers, as the newspapers would call them. After Alvin was released from Lansing in 1931, he joined up with Fred Barker in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they soon put together the Barker-Karpis gang. During the 1930s, the Barker-Karpis gang became one of the most formidable criminal gangs. They would not hesitate to kill anyone who got in their way, even innocent bystanders. Karpis had been described as a leader or brains of the gang. Gang member Fred Hunter said Karpis was super smart and he was reported to have a photographic memory. The other leaders were Dog and Fred, both now out of prison, and the gang included about 25 others. At this time, a myth was started that Ma Barker ruled the gang with an iron fist, but the facts do not seem to support these claims. It was highly unlikely that criminals as adapt to Karpis, and even Mom's sons for the matter, would have listened to her. Karpis later wrote about the subject in his memoirs. Mom was always somebody in our lives. Love didn't enter into her really. She was somebody we looked after and took with us when we moved city to city, hideout to hideout. It is no insult to Ma's memory. She just didn't have the know-how to direct us on a robbery. It would not have occurred to her to get involved in our business, as we always made it a point of only discussing our scores when Ma wasn't around. We'd leave her at home when we were arranging a job, or we'd send her to a movie. Ma saw a lot of movies. Another well-known bank robber of the area, Harvey Bailey, knew the Barkers gang well. In his autobiography published in the 1970s, he agreed with Karpis, observing that Ma Barker couldn't plan breakfast and was certainly no mastermind behind any gang activity. It is reported that Ma Barker's entire reputation as a criminal mastermind was concocted by Hoover to protect the FBI's public image after federal agents discovered they had killed a 62-year-old mother. On December 19, 1931, things became difficult for the gang when Karpis and Fred Barker confronted Sheriff C. Kelly, who was investigating the robbery of a store in West Plains, Missouri. Karpis and Barker shot and killed Kelly, an act that forced them to flee the area. The two had also probably killed an Arkansas police chief, Manley Jackson, a month earlier, but had avoided suspicion at the time. The gang fled to St. Paul, Minnesota, bringing along Ma Barker and her paramour, Arthur Dunlop, where in 1932 Barker, his brother Arthur, Karpis, and Lawrence Duvall robbed the Third Northwestern National Bank in Minneapolis. Duvall killed policeman Ira Leon Evans Groski during the escape, while Barker murdered Oscar Harrison, a passing motorist. Barker and Karpis were also suspected of killing Dunlop, an alcoholic whom they considered to be untrustworthy after someone tipped police off to the gang's hideout. According to other gang members, Dunlop was also abusive to Ma around this time. Around this time, Barker started a relationship with Paula Harmon, the widow of bank robber Charles Harmon. Karpis did not approve of Paula, considering her to be a quote-unquote drunk and a quote-unquote rotten choice, though they couldn't tell that to Freddie. The gang became nationally notarized in 1933-34 when they organized the kidnappings of local businessmen William Ham and Edward Bjermer. The crimes were orchestrated by racketeers Jack Piffer and Harry Sawyer, with inside information about police activity being provided by corrupt officer Tom Brown, who ran the Kidnap Squad. Other carried out the kidnappings with a different accomplice each time. They netted $100,000 for the first victim and twice that for the second. In 1933, on the same weekend as the Kansas City Massacre, they kidnapped William Ham, a millionaire Minnesota brewer. outside of his office. After the gang was paid a ransom of $100,000, they released Ham. Shortly after this, they abducted St. Paul banker Edward Bremer, and he was released after the gang was paid $200,000 by his family. During the Bremer kidnapping, Barker nearly shot the victim dead when the ransom was not paid promptly. The father of the kidnapped Edward Bremer was a friend of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt had been mentioned the kidnapping in one of his fireside chats, and fueled also by the Lindbergh kidnapping. The FBI and local police bureaus greatly stepped up their pursuits of those engaged in these types of crimes. The kidnappings, however, led to the gang's end. It was Barker who made a slip-up that led to the gang's capture. Having collected the ransom from Bremer, Barker was driving the captive to a drop-off point. Along the way, he stopped to refuel from a gas can and removed a glove while doing so. The discarded can was recovered, and Barker's fingerprints were identified. The FBI had by this time organized a group of highly skilled agents called the Flying Squads, which specialized in hunting down the leading public enemies, and they had been very effective. On January 6, 1935, just after Ma and Fred's death in a shootout with the FBI, Karpis nearly met his own violent end when the FBI located him in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Karpis and Harry Campbell managed to shoot their way to an escape, though Karpis' 8-month pregnant girlfriend, Dolores Delaney, was hit in the thigh by a wild shot fired by Campbell. She was captured along with Campbell's girl. Dolores gave birth to a son who was adopted by Karpis' parents. Karpis and Campbell hid out with a brothel keeper, Edward Berry, for several months. Karpis continued his crimes with others, but had to keep on the move more than ever, as he was the fourth and last of the FBI's public enemies #1. The previous three, Don Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Babyface Nelson, having been killed. He did manage to pull off a crime that echoed the times of the Old West, a train robbery in Garrettsville, Ohio, which netted $27,000. With the FBI in pursuit, Barker and Karpis attempted to get plastic surgery to alter their appearance and remove their fingerprints. The procedure was carried out by Morin, an underworld doctor. The operations were so painful that Fred asked one of his friends to shoot him to stop the pain, but his friend refused. Morin disappeared shortly thereafter. A badly decomposed body was discovered a year later, washed up from Lake Erie on Crystal Beach, Ontario, Canada. Police identified it as Morin. Reorganization and renaming in 1935 from the Bureau of Investigation created in 1908. J. Edgar Hoover was appointed as the acting head of the Bureau in 1924 and completely transformed the agency. Despite its successes, however, the agency had many problems. In those days, when the application of science and technology to fight crime was still in its infancy, the agency was at the mercy of public citizens for information. Often agents on bad information were sent off to remote locals on tips that turned out to be red herrings. The personal low point for Hoover came at an April 1936 United States Senate hearing. Senator Kenneth McClure of Tennessee lambasted Hoover for the performance of the FBI and the fact that Hoover himself had never personally arrested anyone. After the hearing, a determined Hoover vowed he would capture Karpis personally. Hoover did not have to wait long. On May 1st, 1936, the FBI located Karpis in New Orleans, and Hoover flew there to be in charge of the arrest. On May 2nd, shortly after 5 p.m., as a dozen or so agents swarmed over Karpis' car, Hoover announced to Karpis that he was under arrest. A couple versions of the arrest had been reported. Karpis' version told in his memoirs was that Hoover came out only after the other agents had seized him. Only then did the agents call Hoover that it was safe to approach the car. The official FBI version states that Hoover reached into the car and grabbed Karpis before he could reach for a rifle in the back seat. In fact, the car, a Plymouth coupe, had no back seat. The scene was further confused when Hoover told his men to, quote, put the handcuffs on him, end quote. Not one agent had brought handcuffs. Karpis was tied up with an agent's necktie. The capture of Karpis catapulted Hoover into the public eye and made his name synonymous with law enforcement until he died in 1972 at the age of 77. Arthur soon left Florida for Chicago. Karpis also moved on, leaving Fred and Ma in the house. On January 8, 1935, FBI agents caught up with them after Arthur was spotted and arrested in Chicago. A map found in his possession indicated that other gang members were in Ocklawaha, but did not identify the address. The FBI soon located the house in which they were staying after identifying references to a local alligator named Joe and questioning locals about newcomers. On the morning of January 16, 1935, agents surrounded the house at 13250 East Highway C-25. Unknown to the FBI, Karpis and other gang members had left 3 days before, leaving only Fred and Ma in the house. Ordered to surrender, Fred opened fire. The resulting firefight lasted for about 15 minutes. The FBI agents retreated to a safe distance and threw smoke bombs into the house. Gunfire continued from the house, and Fred and Ma apparently moved from room to room as shots came from different windows. The FBI returned fire. Allegedly, many local people came to watch the events unfolding, even holding picnics during the gun battle. Gunfire ceased, coming from the house after 5 hours. The FBI ordered local estate handyman Willie Woodbury to enter the house wearing a bulletproof vest. Woodbury reported that the occupants were dead. Both bodies were found in the same front bedroom. Fred Barker's body was riddled with bullets, but Ma appeared to have died from a single bullet wound. A Thompson submachine gun was lying between the bodies of Fred and Ma until October 1st, 1935. Their bodies were put on public display and then stored unclaimed. Then relatives had them buried at Williams Timber Hill Cemetery in Welch, Oklahoma. After the death of Ma and Fred, Karpis allegedly sent word to FBI Chief G. Edgar Hoover that he intended to kill Hoover the way Hoover had killed Ma and Fred. According to Karpis, in the Alvin Karpis story, the death threat was a rumor started by Hoover himself. In 1971, Karpis wrote in his autobiography that the identification was mistaken. He had claimed that Morin had been murdered by the Bakers. He claimed that Morin had been murdered by the Barkers and then buried in a lime pit in Michigan. The most accepted version of the tale is that Karpis and Fred Barker took Morin on a boat ride on Lake Erie, during which they both murdered him. He was killed either for his botched surgeries or for shooting his mouth off about the gang in a brothel. The last time Morin was seen alive was at a brothel in which he drunkenly bragged, quote, "I have you guys in the palm of my hand," end quote. He left the bar with Karpis and Barker and was never seen again. Karpis was brought to trial at the St. Paul Federal Courts building, now Landmark Center. Karpis initially pled not guilty, but as the case was called for trial, quote, Thomas J. Newman, attorney for Karpis, told the court his client was one of the actual kidnappers of Ham, desired to plead guilty, end quote. 2 weeks later, Karpis offered, quote, through his attorney Thomas Newman, to plead guilty to the Broomer conspiracy, end quote. If kidnapping charges were dropped, the court accepted the offer. Sentenced to life imprisonment, Karpis was incarcerated at then recently constructed Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary from August 1936 to April 1962. For 6 months in 1958, he was transferred to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, but was then returned to Alcatraz. His main job at Alcatraz was working in a bakery. He was far from a model prisoner, frequently fighting with other inmates. Karpis served the longest sentence of any prisoner at Alcatraz, 26 years. On January 8, 1935, Doc was identified and was arrested in the street by FBI agents. When asked, "Where's your gun?" Barker replied, home, and ain't that a hell of a place for it, end quote. He was interviewed by Melvin Purvis, who later wrote, quote, he sat in a chair, jaw clenched, looking straight ahead. He was not impressive looking, only his eyes told a story of innate savagery, end quote. Bolton was also taken into custody, while Barker refused to speak. Bolton revealed that the other members of the gang were in Florida. Barker was charged with the kidnapping of Broomer. He attempted to intimidate Bremer to stop his testimony, telling him, quote, I have plenty of contacts out there who will get you, end quote. Barker was convicted of the kidnapping and sentenced to life in prison. In April 1962, with Alcatraz in the process of being closed, he was transferred to McNeil Island Penitentiary in Washington State. While at McNeil, Karpis met a young Charles Manson. Karpis wrote about Manson in his autobiography with Robert Leslie, 1980. This kid approached me to request music lessons. He wants to learn guitar and become a music star. Little Charlie is so lazy and shiftless. I doubt if he'll put in the time required to learn. The youngster has been in first orphanages, then reformatories, and finally federal prison. His mother, a prostitute, was never around to look after him. I decided it's time someone did something for him, and to my surprise, he learns quickly. He has a pleasant voice and a pleasing personality, although he's unusually meek and mild for a convict. He never has a harsh word to say and is never involved in an argument. After Manson had become proficient on the guitar, he asked Karpis for help in getting a job playing in Las Vegas. As Karpis had contacts with nightclub and casino owners there, Manson told him he would be bigger than the Beatles, but Karpis decided to leave Manson on his own regarding his music career. Karpis was released on parole in 1969 and deported to Canada. Although he initially had difficulty obtaining Canadian passport credentials, having had his fingerprints removed by underworld physician Joseph Morgan in 1934, he settled in Montreal. He wrote his first memoir in 1971, while another memoir book was published in 1980, 1 year after his death. During his first book tour across Canada for Public Enemy No. 1, for McLean and Stewart, published in the United States as the Elvin Karpis story. Karpis looked more like an accountant than a gangster, still showed a dry sense of humor. In Edmonton, Alberta, while shuffling Karpis between various interviews with the media, M&S book representative Ruth Bertelson asking Karpis if he wanted to come in with her. Karpis said, quote, no dear, you take care of the vault. I'll drive, end quote. He became a mentor to her young son, and to the psychopathy of some of his advice to her child angered Burleson. He moved to Spain in 1973. On August 26, 1979, he died by what was originally ruled suicide by the authorities, as sleeping pills were found by his body, but later was ruled death from natural causes. Robert Lively, who co-wrote Karpis' 1979 book, said Karpis was not the type to commit suicide. Lively said Karpis was a survivor, having served 33 years in prison, and also stated Karpis was anticipating the publication of the book. Lively believed Karpis had been introduced to pills and alcohol by his last girlfriend Nancy to give a relaxing high, and perhaps Karpis accidentally overindulged on one occasion, with fatal consequences. No autopsy was performed, and Karpis was buried the next day in San Miguel Cemetery in Malaga, Spain.